start stream.
Live streaming is on.
Hello, everyone. I'm Wayne Hunter with AvTek Solutions. Welcome you here today. I hope you get something from this. For those that joined us last week, the video is up on the actual site. You can go to the resources page via your registration link and be able to look at what last week was. If you missed it, you can go back and see it as well. Today, I have with me is Joe Randall. He's the Director of Agency Operations for DataStream. And what we're going to talk about this week is a little bit different from what we talked about last week. Last week, we talked about the industry as a whole, what's going on in the industry, and things like that. Today, we're going to talk about how do you identify what requirements you have from cybersecurity insurance based off what we talked about last week with all the different changes, from FTC safeguard rules to CMMC to just standard insurance requirements that are done in each industry. So with that, Joe, welcome. I appreciate you being here. And hopefully we can do a little education for folks today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, sir. And yeah, always happy to visit. And education is priority number one to us over at DataStream. With this evolving, challenging industry, it's so important to stay abreast of all the latest happenings. So really happy to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So let's dive in here a little bit. So as we go through here, one of the things we look at is customers we talk with. They say, hey, we got our house in order and all these. And when we talk with them, I ask them about certain requirements and they go, well, we don't have to do that. And I'm like, well, actually, if you look at your insurance policy, there are requirements in there. And, these underwriters are pretty good about how they write things. And sometimes it might be a little bit obscured to be nice. But in any policy, we found that there is a list of requirements from what things you need to have in place to meet policy requirements to how you actually process an RRP and who you call first and do those things as part of an attack in what you do. And we've looked at a lot of different policies. You guys have worked with me to help audit some of these policies. And it always surprises me how much we find out when we audit that and what the actual customer doesn't realize that when they sign the policy, they have all these requirements they didn't know about.
Absolutely. And of course, it's something we're seeing day in, day out as well. And I think people can be confused for a good reason. It's a confusing product in a confusing industry. And as you mentioned, sometimes the documents can be lengthy. We have some internal, insurance jokes that we discuss as a team. And one is that if you want an underwriter to make something more clear, they're going to add 10 pages and they think that makes it more clear. But in fact, of course, it makes it more confusing. And on top of that, you add in renewing a policy year over year. Things might change year to year. So someone who's had a policy in place for a couple of years might be surprised that there are some new requirements coming up for this coming year. And it's important to be aware of those. And as you mentioned, whenever we're working to educate people about this product of cyber insurance, the most important thing is that you can use the policy, right? And that it's effective and that you have an expert team there to support in case of an incident. And so that's why it's so important, what you mentioned with an incident response plan and making sure that step by step, you know what to follow, because the only reason you have this policy is in case the worst happens, or even the half worst happens, right? That you have a team there and that your policy is there to support you.
Well, and in what we talk about here is, one of the things is there's two components of it. And it's not just what's in the policy, but also what you're doing internally. So having folks that understand how security is applied, processes are applied, as standard operating procedures are done, what your actual policies are in the environment that drives, whether it be industry, federal, state, whatever the scenario is of these requirements, there's two things to make sure you got a line. And that's the reason why I enjoy working with you guys is that taking the policy, you guys will audit that. I'm able to look at that and help talk with the customer about what they're doing and bring those two things together. And so it's not just one thing you look at, it's multiple, and having the expertise from multiple sides to help develop that map and make sure you're not missing something.
Absolutely. And that's where we talk about our three-pronged approach. Same thing you're saying is what we are
Mhm.
stressing to people all the time. It's making sure that the front and the back end are covered. And even more important, well, as important as that is that we know what to do on the front and the back end is a step-by-step approach.
Okay. So when we look at it out there, what we found here, when you people are underprepared, it's really interesting because I find that the way things were done before and what gets people kind of not prepared in what they're doing is, let's take just incident response plans and mapping that to the requirements. For a long time, because of the cybersecurity riders that were very loosely written, I guess is the appropriate way to say it.
Yes.
Um, People would take an RP plan, take it off a template off the shelf, change some names and all this, put it in place, and that would suffice. Same thing with their policies. When looking at the security, and what I'm finding here is people confuse, the security and compliance and all these things, and saying, well, it's the one and the same thing, but it's not. And so when you start breaking that stuff apart, we start finding that people, what they think they have is not what they have. So they're partially prepared. It's not, I don't run into many that's not any prepared. They have something, but what that something is, they believe is the whole thing. And not how is that the same thing you're seeing from an insurance side as a broker, multiple different insurance
Absolutely.
platforms?
Absolutely, it is. I mean, it's it is again an area where I feel like people can be confused for a good reason, right? Either sometimes they're using a rider to a general liability policy, or maybe just a very bare bones cyber liability policy, and their broker tells them, "Hey, this is a cyber insurance policy," and so they think they have cyber insurance, but not understanding that a rider or a bare bones policy really doesn't cover the majority of incidents that are likely to happen. And I think that this slide you have up here is spot on. And I think a lot of this is because people don't think they are targets. But what we find,
Yes.
and we deal exclusively in the small and medium business market, actually the majority of cyber incidents are in that SMB market.
Mhm.
And so people kind of feel like, hey, this is an issue that's just for the Fortune 1000 companies or for the cities and the states and municipalities. But no, it's actually more likely to have an attack for an SMB business than it is for a Fortune 1000 companies. I think those attacks on a city or a state, they're huge and they make the newspapers.
Mhm.
But the more common day in, day out, cyber criminals are targeting the people that they feel like are underprepared. And that
Right.
is typically the SMB market.
And really, it's the biggest thing I found in that when you start looking at these things, that what they have to understand is the reason why the SMB market is 62% of most attacks happen in the SMB market. Not anybody. You hear about the big ones, like you said, but the reason why the SMB market is such a rich target is because the small businesses, they don't think they're a target, but they have customer information. They
Mhm.
have a lot of information. And what it is, you may only have 10 customers, right? But most likely, I can hack your environment because you don't have the things in place to protect you. And I get those 10. And then if I get 10 each from those, I get another 10 times, and then multiples start happening. It's kind of like the penny a day.
Mhm.
And at the end, I got millions of dollars, right? It's the
A-
same concept. So
Absolutely. It,
it's that false sense of security. And that's what starts getting these folks where they're not prepared as much as they should be.
Absolutely. And the I think there's a perception that and it can be true where we think of a cyber criminal, we think of like someone sitting in a dark room, in a non-extradition country, which does happen quite often.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
sadly, a lot of this is automated. There's a lot of
Yep.
bots out there. There's a lot of they even call it ransomware as a service. It's heartbreaking to that's a thing, but it's an automated process. So a lot of times people are thinking, oh well, no one's going to be targeting me and what I do in my industry in my business, but they're not even considering that those. It's sometimes literally just bots combing
Yep.
out there, and once they find a vulnerability, then they discover what type of company it is and
Right.
where they
And they
are in the
dig.
industry.
Exactly. So let's dig a little bit more in, and we take these and let's talk a little bit more about, how do we prepare ourselves? So in doing that, first you got to understand. That's the reason why we titled this, what are the requirements? Do you meet the requirement? Because before you do anything else, you got to figure out what it is you got to do, right? So obviously in any things you talk about, and especially being in I deal a lot with the finance market, it's all about risk, right? How do I reduce risk? What is acceptable risk? And how do I determine that? So when you're approaching it from the requirements of reducing risk or transfer of risk to cyber insurance policy, what are some of the common things that you're seeing that is being underwriters are talking about to reduce that risk that they're asking about if you got in place?
Well, I mean, the big three are probably ones that you're talking about day in, day out. It's having great backups, number
Mm-hmm.
number one. It's having a really strong firewall. It's having multi-factor authentication, right? These are the things that are sort of non-starters in the industry.
Okay.
When you talk about multi-factor authentication, that's something that's misunderstood oftentimes too, because there are now applications that will actually ask this in multiple stages. Do you have it for email? Do you have it for remote access? Do you have it for people who have privileged access? So they're really starting to dig in more to not just these yes or no check boxes, but they're looking at the implementation and also how things are managed, how things are updated. And those are just kind of the starters, right? And then having an endpoint detection response, an EDR in place is something that, depending on the industry, may be required, and more as well. But those are sort of like the basics that I think are just so important because they work so well, right? They
Mm-hmm.
put someone in a good position. But for a policy to be put in place, that's what we're really looking for. And it's evolving too, is a really interesting
Yeah.
thing. We just got a refreshed application process 2 weeks ago from a lot of carriers. So they're really starting to put more scrutiny into this.
Yeah. I'm starting to see things from underwriter questions that are like, okay, how many records in your environment
Mm-hmm.
contain PII information? Well, in the back, when I say back in the day, I'm saying maybe a couple of years ago at the furthest, when they asked about PII, they was just saying, hey, you got credit card information, you got this, you got that, you doing it, yes or no? Now it's, do you have PII information? How many records, and where does it live? And when they talk about records, the requirement is not a file. That also includes databases. Well, how are you going to search for all that? It's even including what PII have you got in your internet browsing cache. That's because people save their passwords in their Google
Mm-hmm.
and all that in their cache there. They save it. And so those are the things going here. So the biggest thing about reducing risk is understand what we're seeing the insurance companies do is now those requirements that used to be about 4 or 5 are expanding quickly. But then you also got to layer on state stuff, like you got the Shield Act up in New York, you got the California, it's got theirs. If you're in certain types of things like the FTC safeguard rule that's going in effect next month is really going to catch a lot of people by surprises if they don't know about it. So I want to dig a little bit more into that as we go along. So in the reducing risk, obviously where I've sat in front of and presented to some of the folks is I find a common thing. Well, I got security in place. I'm compliant. No, that's not what it means. And doing these requirements and finding these requirements, you got requirements of putting in and getting your security, but then you have your requirements of, are you compliant based on industry and all that? And cybersecurity insurance are looking at both of those. They're not one thing that we're seeing today. Is that common to what you're seeing as well?
That is kind of what we're seeing, and I think that is the increased scrutiny, kind of what you were talking about just before that too. A related theme on a lot of these applications. For years, it was just check boxes, yes or no.
Yep.
Then it turned into, okay, if you check yes, now there's a couple other questions that pop up. We want to know, the process. We want to know what software it is. So they're starting to look more in detail. And I think that rolls right into this theme as well. There's starting to be a lot more thought put into that.
You know, that's like when the requirements like incident response plan is a requirement. You have one? Yes. Have you tested it daily, weekly, monthly, semi-annually, yearly? What's your test cycle? When you answer that question, then they go into another process of questions. So now the same thing about the looking at the requirements around PII information. They ask, you know, how many records you got? As soon as we supplied that, they go, okay, where does those records live? So then we have to give them paths to the records. Then they say, okay, what compliance frameworks do those map to? And then once you do that, then what is your security protocols on your security stack side? How is it configured to protect all those places? And I've never had those questions and requirement questions like that from an insurance company until about 4 months ago.
Yeah, well, that's the same thing we've been seeing. We we have refreshed questionnaires from just about every carrier at this
Mm-hmm.
point, and the theory of it is pretty interesting. It's sort of that double-edged sword, right? It's becoming a little bit more complicated. It's also becoming a little bit more expensive to get cyber insurance, but the reason for that is because there have been a lot of incidents. There's been a lot of claims,
Right.
and and so the carriers now are really adjusting to whoa, let's look a little bit more under the hood rather than just these yes no check boxes, and let's so they're starting to get a little bit more smart on process, which in turn, as you alluded to earlier, will be a good thing because these are all smart things to have in place,
Mm-hmm.
and even in the conversations that I have, which are not nearly as detailed as you're going on your end, um, a lot of times people sort of just brush off with it. Yeah, I have that. Yeah, I have that. Yeah, I have that. It's like, well, let me see it. Let's look at it. Let's
Exactly.
make sure we can use it. And then they're like, oh well, okay, maybe we should remake it. Then we're kind of because that's the most important thing, like you said with the IRP, is testing it, making sure everyone's on the same page, but ultimately using it and having it be effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to that point, that was one of the things that someone asked me previously. It's like, well, if I say yes, then they go ask another question, and it comes into that. But it's the you got to understand is, yeah, we're talking about how we reduce our risk. The client reduces their risk, but it's also how the underwriters are reducing their risk. So you got to keep in mind is it's just not your risk they're reducing; it's theirs as well. So it's just the state of its being because it's all those big payouts. That's just like Lords of London now saying nation state attacks are considered active war and they're not going to cover it. You know, so they're changing. There's various requirements that are changing almost real time. So you've got to really pay attention.
They are, and it's so important to pay attention to it and make sure we're in it in a good place with it. But it's also the whenever there's a movement like this in an evolving industry, there's reasons, right?
Yep.
And these reasons are pretty scary. So it's important for us to focus on it too, because it's just a real risk. There's a lot of risk out there right
Mm-hmm. So when we go in there and look at a cybersecurity program, and one of the things we've been really helping, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, is when you develop your requirements, part of your requirements you figure out, but then you got to figure out how you're going to take care and prove that you're meeting those requirements, right? And so once we've identified it, we talk about depending on its agency. If you're like in banking, you got your, FINRA and FFIEC, your CMMC, you got CMMC one, DOD, you got CMC, whatever it may be. Cybersecurity insurance is really based off CIS controls and a subset of them. So you look at those, you layer that. Now I know what I got to meet. Now I got to talk about proving how I meet them, because you alluded to it just a moment ago. Is now you say yes, show me, right? And so this is where you got to come into that other piece is coming in policies. We talked about standard operating procedure. We talked about uh, policies and tying those two together. How am I testing it? How am I verifying it? Can I remediate the issues? How am I doing it? Do I have that proof I'm doing it? So there's one side of it saying I have it. Then the other side of it, how do I show that I'm doing it and how do I maintain it? So that's where we're seeing in the industry right now. We help figure out requirements working with the insurance company. And then someone like me is coming in and helping, okay, let's map this to that. Or you got your team. If you have an internal team, hey, great, you know that. You need help, we'll help you. But let's make sure we marry these two places together. Now, when I have that, now that constitutes compliancy. So now you got to determine another set of requirements. What do I have requirements for my tool sets to meet what my cybersecurity insurance requirements are, right? So before you dive into this, I'm gonna jump. I think I saw a couple of questions here. Unless someone is coming here, I think Lee, he's got a problem. The application gets the form. The applicant gets the form fill out of the first time and is being asked questions that never were considered before. Check and balances for wire transfers, so they answered no. Does the applicant get a chance to put in a policy after submitting the application that can reduce their rate?
It is an excellent question. That was from Lee? I think that was
That's from
okay.
Lee Sedman.
That's a
Yeah,
very intelligent question. I would expect nothing less. It's interesting, the landscape. I would say, by and large, that needs to happen in the application process. And there can be times when a carrier will prorate something midterm, but it's difficult to do. So why we really love working uh, with the IT professionals when we're putting an insurance policy into place is because a way we would recommend to do that is, first, let's learn about the security control someone has. And then if we're working on an application, let's say we want to give maybe 60 days, well, 30 days at least, but particularly if we're being thoughtful, if we can give 60 days to put a policy in place. So if we're looking at something now, we want to have a policy effective January 1st. What we can do is we can fill out that application with the controls that we know will be in place, working together with you because they're partnered with you and you're helping them there. So we can answer that application in the posture we know will be in place January 1st and give ourselves that runway to put everything into the position to get us the best rate, to get us the right carrier, to get us the best claims handling procedure. I am very hesitant to ever tell someone to, sign an application, get the insurance, and then try to change something after, because it's it's the insurance industry. Everything has to be in writing. It's heavily regulated. I just think we have a much better shot at planning for the future in true collaboration with the IT professionals to get things in place ahead of time to get us in the best spot. So if I interpreted the question correctly, that's the way I would handle that. And that's really at the root of how we operate and why the partnership between insurance and IT professionals is so important, to get people prepared in the right way.
and that really goes to Lee. That was great, and because it's kind of the part of we're talking about this whole presentation from a standpoint of requirements and how you determine and stuff like that. Because you're looking at right now what you've got and what's going on, but like you say, Joe, you got to be forward thinking and coming to that. Be aware of what's going on in the industry, what changes may come. So if we was writing a policy today and we didn't take into account what goes live on December, was it December 8th is when FTC applies, I think it is. If we don't take that into account, we might not be meeting the requirements that we're going to need to meet starting in December. So that's, always got to have that little forward thinking to that. So you mentioned working with IT and the IT companies, and it's really the dovetail right into the slide we're talking about here. Is you got the requirements there, but then working with the IT company, understanding what they currently have, so we can figure out what needs to be updated here on the IT security side to meet the requirements of the cybersecurity. So then we write the policy. And that question is a prime example of what we're talking about here in this slide.
Absolutely. And also very, very helpful. And I mean this in the best way possible, but one reason that I think it's very valuable to educate people on this is because, like, to this specific question, if someone is saying that no, they have no checks and balances for wire transfers, like, let's jump in and get a process in place there, because that scares me.
Yeah.
Insurance or no insurance, I think it's so valuable to bring these things to light in areas that we can help and add value. Because it's interesting how, well, I think I was going to actually talk about this in a few slides, but the financial areas of wire transfers, social engineering is the most common thing that we see day in, day
Right.
out, even though it does not hit the front page of the newspaper like a ransomware or a data
Right.
breach attack.
Right. So we come in this and look at the controls, and we talk about cybersecurity controls. And as I mentioned previously, there is the cybersecurity insurance is based off CIS controls. So when we talk about controls, there are standards, and those standards have controls that says, you must meet these things. Do you have it in place or not? If you don't, that brings you out of compliance. That also brings you into where you got these things in. So as we was talking about earlier about some of the things you got to look at were typical requirements we're seeing today. We talked about, perimeter firewall, multi-factor authentication, EDR, because now, if you don't have EDR, everyone I've seen here of late, if you don't have EDR on it, that's an issue. Vulnerability management, where that one I'm seeing as requirements is used to, have you had a pen test done this year? Yes, no, get the results of it, and that would carry you. Now, because of how specifically phishing attacks have actually hurt the vulnerability of a business to be able to go and hack bank accounts, stuff like that, I'm seeing now where are you doing vulnerability scans at a minimum monthly and can prove doing it? Are you also have a plan, remediation plan that pulls that and you're updating that going across? Can you show me evidence of that and your procedures of how you go do it? I'm seeing questions like that today. Typical spam filters, that's always been around. Security awareness training, offsite backups. Now, you mentioned offsite backups about having good backups, but let's constitute what I'm seeing as a requirement now. Everybody knew the 3-2-1 rule. Okay. I want to have 3 copies of my data and 2 different types of media and at least 1 copy offsite. That's the old traditional 3-2-1 rule. Now, what I'm seeing is 3-2-1-1. And that second one is, do I have a copy on immutable storage? Do I have a mutable backup copy that cannot be encrypted, that can't be deleted? And I see that more and more often coming into that. So having good backup, stuff like that, but also how you protect that backup to keep it from being deleted or encrypted. So these are traditional ones. Are there ones outside of this that are you seeing that we need to be aware of and look at when we're looking at these policies and things outside of these 7?
Well, I think this is a very solid list. And it's an interesting area because people get very confused about this, I think.
Yes.
And because sometimes there's a discrepancy between, okay, what is truly required just to get anything and
Right.
what's required to get us in the position that we're well protected and we can use our policy. It handles claims in a great way and that we have a team around us to help, because let's just look at the entire marketplace and say there's 40 insurance carriers that offer cyber liability and cyber riders too, right? Well, someone might think, oh, well, I might not need all 7 of these to get this thing I heard my friend has that's called cyber insurance. But then when we look at that side, what they have, it's maybe a rider that doesn't cover ransomware, it doesn't cover cybercrime, it doesn't cover business interruption. So it's not true. So this, if we're having a thoughtful approach to get into a policy with a carrier that's reputable, that's going to pay the claims that are made, that's going to pay them in a way that is effective for you, but also you don't have to pay up front for all the claims and they get reimbursed later, because we really want to avoid that. That's where this really comes in, because we want, whenever we're helping someone think about their security and think about potentially an insurance policy, it's, hey, we're just not looking to get the bare bones policy that might not require all 7 of these. We want to be with the companies that do require these, because there's a reason they require them.
Right.
Their reputation, they're going to pay the claims, they're going to all these things that they're going to do, and they're going to have, most importantly, the best vendors available for you to help any situation that happens on the back end. So I just think this topic, but also a few others, if anyone is feeling confused about what they hear, it's for a good reason. It's a confusing industry, and there's a lot of I wouldn't say misinformation, but like misguided information out there. But this is a great list of what will put someone in a place to start looking at the top tier insurance carriers that are going to be really beneficial to have.
One of the things, I got an interesting question the other day is I was talking with a client, and he says, when he's talking to the insurance folks, and I was talking to him about doing an audit of his policy, he asked me, he says, is there a standard list of questions that all insurance underwriters ask? And I went, if you find it, send it to me, because I have not found one. So when we talk about this list here, we know as an aggregate, this is a list of things that all of them are going to be concerned about. But I have never seen a list that all of them come from a standard list of questions. Just like I said, like I had the one where it's asked me about drilling down on the PII. That's the only insurance underwriters ever asked me that question. None of the others have ever asked me that level. So I don't know of any standards other than we take from what we've seen consistently asked, and we come up with this list.
Absolutely. And it's the whole cyber insurance market's in a really fascinating place. I use fascinating loosely because I guess I'm in insurance, so I can think that insurance is fascinating. But
it's perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's a relatively new product. When you look at something like auto insurance, right? It's been around for so long, or workers' comp insurance, or those are areas where, yeah, there are pretty standard questions. If you look at a policy, that the different coverages are called the same terms by different carriers. It's kind of plug and play. Cyber insurance is a little bit like the Wild West in a way that not only are there different questions on different applications, but sometimes in the quotes and in the policies, different coverages will be referred to with different terms. And it can get very confusing. So it's just a bit unstandardized because it's a newer product, but I think we're moving towards a place where over the next few years, and we're not talking next month, but I think it will be more standardized. But just right now, everyone's sort of scrambling to figure it out in terms of a relatively new product.
Yeah. Well, not only from a new product standpoint, but as we alluded to other things like the FTC safeguards, CMMC, updates of Fedline and other things like that, the industry are changing their rules. They're tweaking their requirements, which when that happens, then that makes the underwriters of insurance having to tweak theirs. So it's a cascade effect. So as long as there's that change, and there's a lot of change going on out there, it's always going to be a moving target. And that's the reason why it's very important to understand when you're looking at a policy, how do I determine what those requirements are? Where's the state of the industry today? What's potentially coming out? Let's get and plan it together. That way we make sure it covers ourselves. What's going on. And it's always going to be that way. It's not like the old time where you do the policies like the car policy. You take it, sign it, put it in your drawer, and I don't worry about it for a year. That's not how it is today. I got that policy. Now I got to make sure I'm staying in sync with that policy and make sure as a whole opened up. So it's totally changed how we have to do things today.
Absolutely. And it's just interesting. Yeah, I actually have a couple of comments for, I think, later on about this, just in the way that's going to be viewed from the carrier underwriter perspective. Right. You're spot on there.
Yeah. So, and we've talked about this, and this is one of the areas where, dealing with banks and things of this nature, that group being heavily regulated as they are, they're used to doing insurance plan, the instant response plans. But the reason why I bring this up, because we talk about it and I keep coming back to it, I keep finding, I want people to understand, we talk about the small companies and we look at these requirements and we think we got a handle on it, we go do it. When you look at a finance industry and banking and that's heavily regulated, they have whole teams that work on this. But yet in 2021, there was fined $283 billion in fines. Because there's the model of, hey, I do it, it's done, I set it over here, I don't have to worry about it till next year. The problem is what's creating that problem, even in a heavily regulated industry, is things are evolving so fast and changing so fast, it opens up holes they don't know about because they're not actively monitoring. And I sat with several big banks, and that was the common theme between that. And they said, Everyone needs to understand this, and this is what creates the problem. So focusing on this, now they're doing like table to take your IRP, and we say, hey, take it, get in a room with your, what I call, this is, I'm showing my age now, your tiger team, right? Or your red team, as you might want to call it, and sit down and just walk through your IRP. If there's a problem with it, don't fix it. Just mark it out, put it on the board, and keep going. Once you're there, go back to it, and then take that and make sure that your actual operational procedures and your policies get fixed. Don't do it once a year. Don't do it twice a year. You need to do it at minimum quarterly. You should be doing that based on how much change is, so you understand what the requirements are of your IRP.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting too that there's been a lot of just change in the workforce too.
Oh yes.
The last couple of years. And well, one kind of just an anecdote, I was joking with someone that I was helping make an IRP, and they're like, great, I'll just save this on my computer. It's like, okay, well, whoa. Remember, the computer might be brick. So we got to physically print that out and distribute it to everyone, so it's step by step. But where I was going with the change in the industry, it's also ongoing training for new personnel. When we put together an incident response plan, there might be 5 or 6 people that are the first phone calls to put together a team, response team. But those 5 or 6 people might change. We definitely don't want to be in a situation where we're in an IRP where, wait, 2 of these people, they don't even work here anymore.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure we're constantly updating, not just what you're talking about, the security and the plans and procedure, but some of the basic things, like just making sure everyone has a copy, making sure it's the right people, and if they're regularly drilled on what to do and why we're doing it.
That's the biggest holes we find when we evaluate incident response plans. Is it's about the resources, name changes, phone number changes, they moved, they're not in the same location anymore, they're not part of the company anymore, or it's been replaced. The person replaced them, they're nowhere in the plan, never heard of it. And interestingly enough, I run across folks that, yeah, I got it on our file server, it's sitting over here in a secure folder. I went, great. Now, if I delete that, where do you have it? I went,
Yeah.
I said, actually, if you look at the requirements, there are actually requirements that states you must have a physical copy in a secure location offsite. Not electronic copy, a physical copy. And a lot of people don't catch that requirement.
Absolutely. And another thing to look for is that just like the underwriters and the carriers are becoming a little bit more nuanced in their questions, they're also starting to insert more into the policies in an effort to be helpful. They are providing sometimes some instant, like a 24/7 hotline. They might be providing an aspect of an IRP that can be combined into a greater one, but it's important just to check if there are any requirements of the policy that a certain things be done in a certain order, and to marry that into an IRP. What the insurance company is recommending might not, just in all transparency, it might not make the most sense when you're looking at an IRP, but it's important to make sure we check all the boxes, because number one is of course everyone's educated to know how to handle a claim, but number 1A is that I want this policy to pay out for anyone that gets it. We want to make sure these claims are handled promptly. So we want to make sure we're doing things in the right order.
Sounds great. Lee, leave it to Lee. He was on the last webinar, and he always brings up great questions. So Lee, I appreciate you being here. Since changes vary from insurer to insurer presently, how are customers to know what changes are coming ahead of time? That's one of the things, Lee. I'm going to do a first step from my perspective, from what I do for customers and doing managed services and looking at it and making sure things are in place. Myself and my CISO, we are always not only attending certain events that we go to that's about security and about these things and what's going on in the industry, but we're always researching and looking ahead. No, Lee, you're fine. This is exactly what this whole thing's about. So you're great. It's about always having to read and catch up. I highly recommend people to get into peer groups or into certain community forums where it discuss these things and you can pull from your peer. You don't have to be in every one of them, but you actually got a community you can actually ask questions, what's coming up, see that. I'm in many of them, and I'm learning every day. You really got to be diligent about research. Who's doing what? How does that affect me? That's what we do from what we provide from a compliance and security service to help customers. Now, from the insurance industry, Joe, what are you having to do as a broker to stay up with what's all going on out there?
Yeah, no, it's great question. Well, a lot of it is partnering with you guys. We learn a lot from
We do
you,
share a lot of information
of
with each
course.
other. That's for sure.
Yeah, and we do. I do similar. I attend a series of conferences called Net Diligence. It's a cyber risk summit quarterly, where it's one of the only opportunities where the actual underwriters are actually there at these conferences talking about what's coming and what changes may happen. So those are always very interesting, trying to stay ahead. But in terms of actual changes, it's tough to anticipate, honestly.
Mhm.
The good news with insurance being such a slow moving vehicle, that if there is a significant change, it will happen on renewal. It won't happen midterm because an insurance document is a binding document, a legal document. There may be a smaller change that could be implemented midterm, but anything that's significant will happen on renewal, and they will give typically 90 days notice, then 60 days notice, then 30 days notice. So one of the times where kind of a frustratingly slow moving industry works to our advantage, that we should get ample notice of any significant change.
Yep. Sounds good. And I see the other question. I'm gonna hold up just a little bit on that, Lee, because we do have a question to answer at the end. So I want to get through a couple more slides here. So in strategy of reducing risk, we gave the 7 where you're really looking at it, what very common through what insurance underwriters are looking for and things they say. But another thing we're finding that when they start asking about what, in reducing that risk, they start asking about these questions about how's your IT being done? How do you segment things and go in this? When you're a SMB, we find a lot of SMBs that are not necessarily, when you have these questions, they're like deer in the headlights. I'm an owner, I'm running a business, and I've got someone that's doing some IT for me, but you really don't know. And so we started digging in, and it kind of goes along that, hey, is there a general set of questions you're going from? So when I started seeing that, I said, okay, what additional things do we want to look at? What things you should think about that's going to help you reduce that risk, meet those requirements? And these are 5 that we come up with. And I want your input on this to see what you're saying. But one of the big ones is how you segment systems. Most companies will have, when they set up, especially small business, they have a flat network. So once I get that network, I'm king. I'm the king of the kingdom because it's all one. So most don't think about that and how they may want to segment systems to make it harder for them to traverse through your environment. So that's something I do. My team does all the time for customers. Encrypt sensitive information. Doing encryption today is a lot easier because platforms have encrypting drives. Some of the applications can encrypt the data on transport, things of that nature. So those are things you got to look at and make sure our security environment, we put one in place. These things are standard of what we go about. Assess your risk service provider. That's kind of like when banking, you got the BAA, you're all that's so you're asking, hey, do you have these things in? And they report and they give you a report. But like in what we're doing is compliance as a service, it's not just that one time now because it changes and because some of the rule changes. Now we get very specific on what we're asking them, just like the insurance company is asking the client. And we're tracking that and being proactive with that because you have to be these days. Hire experts to test your security. I mean, that's one of the things that insurance folks are looking at. Says, do you have someone outside your firm that's testing your environment? With banks, we've been doing this for years. A lot of small businesses, when you say pen test or vulnerability test, they have no clue about what you're talking about. But that's becoming a thing of standard questions that's going to have you want in place. And then consider it a managed security service provider, an MSP that's doing the security stack and what you're doing there. So, most of us, like myself, that we do this, we don't look to go replace your IT team or whoever's doing IT. We want them to stay there. We want to make them successful and let them work on your business. But this is what we do every day. And we can bring that to them in an affordable way and make sure they're meeting what their requirements are, educate them on those requirements and what they need to do. So these were a set that we looked at that I thought was important to share from your perspective and what the industry is saying. Hey, this is what we want these SMBs to have. What are they saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar, and I would take this same list. I would just work from 5 up, honestly.
Oh, you'd
I
flip
think
it.
that,
Okay.
well, no, I would just say from my. I mean, I think that I highly encourage any business to have a managed security service provider, or especially to be working with experts, right? I just think that in that in working with you, right, or with other people in your industry, kind of takes care of 1, 2, 3, right? It's kind of like if you have the right experts on your team, you have the right professionals around you, then 1, 2, 3 can kind of be taken care of largely by them or with some great advice
That's
from
true.
them. And I think that sometimes people are, well, I don't know, but I think that it's just so hard to keep track of all these things, honestly, for anyone who's not in this world day in, day out. Because just like yourself, I mean, the majority of consultations I have, someone's being pulled away from such a busy schedule and trying to
Mhm.
turn on the security hat or the security, thinking cap for like an hour. And it's just, it really takes constant focus almost to be on top of this.
Yeah, I thought it from the aspect is I deal with a lot of different size customers. I deal from the enterprise space down to the SMB. And so I've got a lot of customers that have full IT teams. So I want to make sure I share information that those teams can go use because they got the
Yeah.
team to go do it and make sure they made that understanding. So my folk was thinking about that. Obviously you're right. From number 5, we do all the ones above and more. But I wanted to make sure from this standpoint, to educate any type of business, whether it's SMB or enterprise, because we all got the same problem. We all got the same requirements.
Right.
It's just economy of scale
Yeah, that
what we
makes
got to deal with.
complete sense. And I find too that it's like when someone does have an internal ITT, I almost recommend it even more to be working with an MSP, if I just from my perspective, because uh, if a company is sizable enough to be actually bringing in full-time staff, then they should also, in my opinion, this is just
Yeah,
Joe's opinion, should also be making a small investment to make sure there's a true expert who's doing the things we're talking about, going to all the conferences, learning about what's coming next to help educate that team and to supplement any gaps that might be there. Because that's what I see. Sometimes internal teams can get into kind of a rhythm, come a little bit stagnant, and they're doing a great job, I'm sure. But having that true like third party voice of someone who's objective is invaluable, in my opinion.
right. So in transfer, we talk about transfer cyber risk. You can't estimate, eliminate. That's really talking about how you're utilizing your cybersecurity insurance and your who bring it into it. So in looking at those requirements, I look at this at a way about making sure how I transfer that risk to my policy is by meeting the requirements of what that policy has stated. To me, that's what that means. From your perspective, what does this mean?
Well, it's interesting. This is the slide I was thinking about in the beginning of our discussion, because we're talking about insurance companies becoming more nuanced in their questionnaires. They're becoming more nuanced in some of their requirements, in having some access to sort of the back end of the industry, knowing some of the underwriters and carriers. It's think about, okay, why are they doing this? And the reason is because there's a lot of large claims being paid out. So, and that tells me there's a large amount of risk out there. So I think what you say, eliminating the tail risk, is very hard and expensive. One of the things about this cyber industry is, let's just take a general insurance claim. Say there's let's just say it's a workers' comp claim, for example. Could, depending on the complexity of it, it could play out in court, knock on wood, hopefully not, but for years, right? And then at the end of a couple of years of um, this claim being talked about, there might be a settlement at the end of the claim, which is not the way I think it should work, but that's sort of the reality of some of these insurance lines work. So the insurance carriers are saying, okay, so if there's a big claim, yeah, it might take a couple of years to have to pay it out, and then might be a percentage of what we thought at first. Whereas in the cyber market, if there's a real incident, the full policy limit's going to be paid out in a matter of days, and they will honor it, but there's a lot more risk there, right? And so when we think about why are the insurers doing the things they're doing, is because they know, wow, this is different than an auto claim where we might be paying a ransom uh, and hitting the full policy limit in 48 hours or whatever it happens to be. And so when I think of it from that perspective, that's where, oh my gosh, there just is a lot of risk here. So having, we want that risk to be on the insurance carrier, we want it to be in the right way. So thoughtful around it. And sometimes these, like if the process is becoming a little bit more frustrating because it is for, myself or other clients, customers, friends, there's a reason, and it's because there's some real risk out there, and there's some real unknown out there too. I think is something that it doesn't get talked about a lot. There's just, evolving so quickly, there might be risks we're not even aware of yet. Yeah, so sorry for the long-winded answer, but
that's fine. Is the next couple of slides that we've really covered pretty well, and what we're coming into is, obviously one of the things I want to talk about this real quick is, with the requirements of backups are there, but one of the things we have to be aware of when we have an attack, you don't want to just start recovering, because the instant stuff comes up. So there's one of the things here I find about backups where, yes, you got to have them. Yes, you got to protect them. But when you do your IRP, there are steps you got to have in place and done before you ever start restoring. And I think, to me, that's a hidden risk that's not spoken about in a way, because if I have the event and I heard it start going and restoring the environment, then I call the insurance company to go and do that, I've just killed the forensics. That could violate the policy where I don't get no payout if I don't end up being able to recover, because I've ruined the forensics capability.
And that's why it's so important, like you're saying, to have a thoughtful incident response plan.
Right.
Make sure everyone's aware of it, and to not just have it, but like you've been said before, it's to be practicing it, to be tweaking it, perfecting it.
And we touched about this on the MFA. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. This has become pretty much kind of like commonplace about what we're talking about. We don't allow anybody to have access to any of our systems unless they use multi-factor authentication. If they're not, then they don't have access. Real simple. And so this is in every insurance policy underwriter question list I get. It's usually the first or second question, always into there. So if you're not doing it, and it's not, oh yeah, I have a couple people doing MFA. No, are you using MFA across the business? You got to keep aware they're going to ask, they're going to look.
Absolutely, it is. And I think Lee had brought up a good question about MFA and allowing remote access. Or I think that maybe it wasn't necessarily about MFA, but it's a good question. And I think
I'm going to come back to Lee's other question. I want to try to get a couple more slides because all these things kind of tie into all the things he's asking there. So Lee, bear with me. I'm coming. We talked about endpoint. This is one of those things is, the endpoint device, not only there, but the MDR, XDR, where you're looking at it from a device, from an infrastructure standpoint. And it's much more than doing AV. The requirements, the reason why they're making these requirements is because traditional AV looks at files and looks at hashes based on a file's access. Ransomware don't work that way. It is something that's a payload that comes in that's off to the side, and then it may sit there, and then it's going to move laterally. Its job is to get credentials. So it watches when you access a file, did you do it with credentials that are priority credentials? And then I'm going to scrape that. And now I'm going to infiltrate. So not all AVs can do that. And that's where these higher end processes come into place for the EDR, MDR, XDR platform. So that's where typically, like, we have full sedge and completely 365 man SOC that watches this. We see it, we isolate it, remediate it, and move forward. If we need to brick a box, we brick a box. So we do it real time. they're going to look at these times how they go do there. They're not looking to do it while you're at work. They want to do it where you're not seeing what's going on in the system, and so you got to have that coming into it. So that's the reason why these requirements are being asked in every questionnaire I get. You're seeing the same thing, right?
I certainly am. Yeah.
Okay. This is one that is the easiest to do, but people don't do it. It's
Yep, that's true.
to me, and it's not very expensive either, but it's almost like, well, I got to go do this again. Well, when you have someone that clicks on the wrong link and the phishing email, and then they transfer all your money out of your bank account, then it becomes very easy to understand why you need that training to come into that. So, because 82, we all been talking about what are the requirements to reduce our risk. Well, here's one of the biggest ones you can do to reduce risk is education. And that's what it is. And you got to be ongoing because everything evolves. The hackers change. They change their tactics. Got to be ongoing training.
And again, we're talking about a changing workforce too, right? New employees, new team members, volunteers in certain industries. So it's just so important to keep up to date on this.
Yeah, that's a big thing we're seeing. And I kind of looking at it as like the whole, this investment, what you look at here, and, investment in cybersecurity technology, investment in cybersecurity insurance. So if you start looking at this, yes, what you're looking at is like, if I got insurance, hey, I'm protected. The only problem is, no, what really protects you is what you're putting in place to do it to meet the requirements of the cybersecurity insurance. So it takes these two things combined to actually get your reduced risk. And I think a lot of people look at the insurance policy as, oh, I'll reduce my risk. Not really.
Well, yeah. And what I think doesn't get talked about a lot too is, okay, if you have an insurance policy and there's an incident is covered, the policy is going to pay out. And so you get some financial restitution there, but there can still be a lot of harm done if you don't have the right security. So even though you're financially compensated for what might have happened, there's still going to be, damage on an ongoing basis. So yes, it hopefully could have been prevented altogether, but even if there is an incident that's covered by insurance, it can be limited. The scope of it can be limited.
Exactly.
You can be made more whole more quickly. So there's a lot of other factors that just are beyond the pure financials of an incident.
So coming here, the things that you're really looking at, and where we're talking about here, and whether it's us or whatever, what we're doing together to help people reduce their risk is really bringing two pieces of the pie together: the industry experts applying compliance, security, applying compliancy, but then the industry experts from the insurance side to make sure we understand what the requirements are from the policy standpoint and make sure we marry those two things together. And since we've been working with you guys, understanding requirements, where we got to be, are we doing the right things to take care of the customer? Because this is what's coming back to Lee's question. As an MSP, we have shared responsibility now. So if I'm providing services, I'm sharing responsibility of this protection. And that's the reason why anybody that does business with me is if you don't want to put my security stack in, I don't do business because I can't protect you. I can't make sure you meet the requirements of what you need to do. So it's all about making sure we understand the requirements together to protect each other.
Absolutely. Very well said.
So coming back to you, Lee, is those things there. One of the questions when you answer that, it's about the shared responsibility. So if you got an MSP that you're working with today, you want to ask them, are they doing the things that we're just talking about today on themselves? So like I do vulnerability scanning religiously. We are using the same tools that we use for our customer, both on the security stack side as well as the compliancy side, to track our policy procedures and if I'm meeting the things I need that I ask customers to do and that it meets my insurance requirements. I'm doing it on myself as well. Every MSP should be doing this. If they're not, then that brings up a question. Are they protecting you? So whether it be my RMM or things of this nature, or multi-factor, I make sure there is no way anybody has access unless they meet our security protocols. and we monitor for that. So when something comes out of compliance, my compliance team drills down on it real quick, because my compliance team is separate of my security stack services team. So there's not, as I like to say, the fox in the hen house. I got two checks and balances. So those are the things you want to look at. Those are the things you want to ask when, if you're looking at an insurance question, you want to talk to your IT team. If it's an internal IT team or an MSP, it should be the same question. Does that, hopefully that answers your question there. I know we're at time, but what I want to say here is we got next week, we're going to dig more into how we combine DataStream and AvTek, how we actually help customers solve these problems. What do we bring to the table to help do these things, and come into that. And if you haven't seen or come in late, you can go to your registration, go to the resources. This will be probably back on this recording will be online probably tomorrow sometime or the next day. The one from the previous is already there. And hopefully you come in and join us next week on the 17th, and when Larry Meter will be with me, and we'll talk about how we're doing this together to help solve problems for the customers and meet their requirements. So Joe, appreciate it. Glad you could be here, and we'll do this again. This was fun.
My pleasure. Yeah, I had a great time. Thank you again for having me on.
Yeah, sounds great, man. I will see you soon, though. All right,
that
everybody.
sounds good.
I appreciate it. I will talk to you soon. I'll see you next week.